did want to bring to you guys a short presentation on my experiences with a PSYC 103 Open Education Resources pilot. But before I get into the experiences I had with my OER pilot, I first want to refamiliarize you with what exactly OER is. So Open Education Resources, more commonly known as OER, refers to pedagogical resources designed and or licensed to be free at the point of delivery. Now within this definition there's two important points I did want to address, the first of which is this idea of free, right? So for something to be an open education resource, it needs to be free at the point of delivery, meaning that at the point at which you're accessing the information, it is completely and 100% zero cost, right? That includes everything ranging from textbooks to assignments, test bank, virtually everything is free at the point of delivery for both the instructor as well as the students. Okay. However, with that said, and as you'll see in the upcoming slides here, there is still money pouring into companies that are designing OER. Oftentimes, companies that are designing open education resources are getting money to create these things from very wealthy donors. So there is money surrounding OER, but it is free at the point at which you're accessing the information. The second point that I did want to address is this idea of an open license. Right? So what does it mean for OER to have an open license? Well, it means, simply put, that you are free to openly distribute the material whenever you want or to whomever you want. Right? So compare this to a traditional publisher like who we use with Norton, where they have more of a traditional license where we are not at liberty to share that document with anyone else. Right? So for example, if we obtain a PDF version of our PSYC 103 Norton textbook, we are not allowed to share that PDF copy with somebody else, right? We're also not allowed, of course, to sell that to anybody else, right? It is a traditional license. Not quite the case with OER, right? So if I download a PDF copy of an Open Education Resources textbook, I can share that with whomever I want completely at my discretion. The other cool part about an open license is that it's also open source, meaning that anyone can potentially edit this information with some restriction, right? And I really want to emphasize this point with restriction because it's not quite like Wikipedia, right? So one big criticism of OER historically has been that it's kind of like Wikipedia and that anyone can kind of just go on and edit whatever information they want kind of willy-nilly. And that's not quite how many open education resource companies work. In fact, the one I use has a very stringent peer review process where in order for the source material to be edited, contributing editors as well as senior contributing authors need to peer review that information to make sure it's living up to the high academic standards of rigor that we know today in psychology, right? So it's not like Wikipedia. You can't just edit the source material whenever you want. There are standards and there's a process that needs to take place before that information can get edited. But we'll go into a little bit more detail on what exactly all that means shortly. In any case, I did want to share with you some of the many benefits of using OER here at RVCC. So if we click this link here, which you will also be able to click provided that I share you this presentation, which I will, we can see here a title, RVCC saves students approximately $3.6 million in textbook costs across 5 years. That is a staggering number. All right, so where is this coming from? Well, we find that since 2018, approximately 80 faculty here at RVCC have been participating in OER pilots, where they have been using open education resources in their classes, and across these 80 faculty, since 2018, we have saved students about $3.6 million in textbook costs, which again is a really high number. Not only that, but by virtue of participating in these OER pilots, we are also required to survey students about their experiences using OER. And this is just a short sample of some of the results we got back from students who used OER in these classrooms. We found that approximately 64% of RVCC students reported greater ability to complete assignments. About 52% of RVCC students reported more interest in their course, and also 56% of students reported greater satisfaction in learning in their OER course. Right? So overall, across 80 faculty since 2018, students' experiences using open education resources have been historically really good. And I am just one of those many faculty who have now participated in this OER pilot and are using OER in my classrooms. And that is the purpose of this presentation today, to share with you some of my personal experiences using OER. So with that said, what textbook did I choose to use for PSYC 103? Well, I chose to use OpenStax. OpenStax is an educational initiative from Rice University to develop and create high-quality OER. Right, so there's another link here we can click on. So if you click on this OpenStax link, it'll take you to the About Us section for OpenStax. And we can see that OpenStax is a part of Rice University, which is a 501c nonprofit charitable corporation. As an educational initiative, it is our mission to improve educational access and learning for everyone. Through our partnerships with philanthropic foundations and our alliance with other educational resource companies, we are breaking down the most common barriers to learning because we believe that everyone should and can have access to that knowledge. Right? So if we scroll down a little bit more, you can get a little bit more information about what exactly OpenStax does, how they work, what their process is, and you can of course explore that at your own leisure. But most importantly, for our purposes, what textbooks do OpenStax provide? Well, so if we go to the Subjects tab and hit the All button, we can see that OpenStax provides free open education textbooks for a variety of different subjects, right? Everything ranging from business to college success to the humanities to math to science and of course the social sciences, which of course we're most interested in psychology. So if we go ahead and hit psychology, it'll take us all the way down to the textbook, and ours is the second one here, Psychology 2nd Edition. So if I click on it, it'll provide us with a very brief summary of the textbook, right? So we see Psychology 2nd Edition is designed to meet the scope and sequence requirements for the single semester Introduction to Psychology course. The book offers a comprehensive treatment of core concepts grounded in both classic studies and current and emerging research. The text also includes coverage of the DSM-5 examinations of psychological disorders. Psychology incorporates discussions that reflect the diversity within the discipline, as well as the diversity of cultures and communities across the globe. The second edition contains detailed updates to address comments and suggestions from users. Significant improvements and additions were made in areas of research currency, diversity and representation, and the relevance and recency of the examples. Right? So how do students access this textbook? Well, traditionally, there are two ways they can do so. The first way, and this is my preferred way, is to just view it online. So if we go ahead and hit the View Online button on the left-hand panel, it'll take us directly to the textbook. Right? So this is an online version of this textbook. Okay, and students are free to highlight things and also leave comments, right? So this is chapter 1. So if I wanted to highlight as a student, I could just go ahead and highlight part of this sentence, and I can add a yellow highlight. Right? What I can also do is I can leave some comments. So I am adding a comment. Now, if students want to access their highlights and comments in one nice organized place, they can do so on this left-hand side panel here. There's a tab that says Highlights. So if I go ahead and click that, you'll see all of my highlights and all of my comments that I've made so far in Chapter 1, which I think is pretty handy. So we're going to go ahead and close that. Another really cool feature of this online textbook is that OpenStax also provides students with a study guide for each chapter. So if we go back to the left-hand side panel, you'll also see a tab here that says Guide. So if I go ahead and hit Guide, you'll see that there is a very nice organized study guide that I can also use as a student to kind of remind myself of what are the most important points in each chapter, which I think can also be of great use to students. Finally, on the left-hand side panel, we have a contents menu. This is essentially a quick bar, so if they want to jump to a specific section or a specific chapter, they could just go ahead and click that. So if I want to jump to biopsychology, I can go ahead and just jump right to whatever section I want, and it'll take me right there. Very quick and convenient. Right? Another way to search information in a textbook is just to use this search bar that you would use kind of like Google. Right? So if I want to find information about major depression disorder, I can go ahead and click that. Oh, hold on. Well, I guess it's more, there we go, major depressive disorder, right? So it recognized that it should have been depressive, and it also kind of corrected me here, right? Major depressive disorder, it'll take me right here to the definition, and you'll see that you can also use that search box to search for virtually any term you want within the textbook. Okay. So that is the online version of the textbook, but there are also ways in which you can download this textbook as a PDF for offline use. right? So if we go ahead back to the left-hand side panel here of the main landing page, we can also download the textbook as a PDF. You can see here it is slowly loading, so students do have the option to use this offline if they so desire. Now you may be wondering, what about print copies? This is probably one big drawback of OER, right? So there is a little disclaimer here saying that OpenStax printed textbooks cost between $18 to $60, lower than the average cost of a print textbook offered for a profit publisher. So you can get a print copy if you want. It kind of, in my opinion, defeats the purpose of OER, because now once again you're paying for something that you originally accessed because you didn't want to pay for something. So the print options aren't great. There are ways to print things for free, of course, right? So if you download the PDF version of the textbook, you could just go to your local printer and download maybe chapters of the textbook at your leisure, but of course you're using your own personal paper to do so. So print copies, not very well supported. It does kind of defeat the purpose of a free and open education textbook if you go ahead and pay for a print copy. So historically, students typically access this digitally online. Okay. So if we scroll down a little bit further here, you'll see some senior contributing authors as well as some contributing authors, right? So these are the groups of people that are primarily making changes to the source material of the textbook, right? So if, let's say, you're reading the OpenStax textbook and you think there should be information that should be included that they haven't included in the textbook, right? What you would do is you would have to submit content to be added. And these contributing authors, as well as senior contributing authors, would then peer review that information to make sure that information is legitimate, it's valid, and it's living up to the high standards of scientific rigor that we come to know and love. Right? So again, I'm going back to this idea that people cannot just add information to the OpenStax textbook willy-nilly. Right? Any information that's being added has to go through a peer review process, and these are the people that are conducting that peer review process. Now, if you're reading the OpenStax textbook and you also notice that there is an error, right? There is an errata section here where you can suggest a correction, right? So if you go ahead and suggest a correction, these individuals as well will review that correction and make changes to the textbook as they see fit, right? So there are ways in which you as an individual can have a direct influence on adding content to the book or even suggesting changes or corrections to the book, which I think is kind of cool. Okay. Scroll down a little bit further, you'll see the publication date of this text as well as the ISBN numbers. Okay. Now, most importantly for our purposes as instructors, there are also some instructor resources that we can utilize very similar to a traditional publisher. So you'll see a bunch of tabs here that you can utilize. Only 3 of them are really relevant to us here at RVCC. The first of which is a Canvas course cartridge package, right? So if you want to just get started with incorporating OER into your course Canvas LMS, you would just go ahead and download, right, this Canvas course cartridge, and it'll automatically import everything you need to get started with OER. Beyond that, there's also an annotated video guide. There are test banks that you can also use, very similar to what you're familiar with a traditional publisher. If we scroll down a little bit further here, you'll also see some things like OER Commons Hub resources, an instructor getting started guide, a transition guide, again, another way to access the test bank. You'll see a section here for lecture slides. Right? So you have a lot of materials that you would typically get with a traditional publisher right here at OER as well. But with that said, probably to me the most exciting feature of OER, that's probably the most unique from a traditional publisher when it comes to instructor resources, is the ability to edit the document itself, or more specifically, edit the textbook itself. And you may be wondering, hold on a second, I thought you told me if I was going to make any edits to the source material, it would have to go through a peer review process. And that is true, right? Any edits that are made to the source material that everybody has access to has to go through a peer review process. However, if you want to edit the book for your own personal use and nobody else would have access to this customization, only you can do that. This is a book customization feature, which I think is way cool. So when I was talking with Isabel about this particular feature, we compared it to the difference between Apple phones and Android phones, right? So a traditional publisher like Norton is kind of like using an Apple phone, where everything is wrapped up in this nice, neat bow. You don't have to edit anything. You don't need to change anything. It is what it is, and you just work with what it is. And there are some advantages to the Apple phone or the traditional publisher, because everything works. It's just set up and you don't have to do anything. However, there can be some drawbacks to that, because if you do want to make significant changes to like how it works, you can't really do that, right? So in a traditional publisher, one point of frustration from me is that I don't see myself as a carbon copy of my textbook, and there's a lot of information that's not included in our Norton textbook that I wish was included. So there are points in lecture where I'm talking about information that may not necessarily be represented in their textbook, and that certainly is not very desirable to me. But what's nice about OpenStax, which is to me is like somewhat analogous to using an Android phone, is that there's far more customization options available to you, right? If there's information that's not covered in OER that I wish was included in OER, I can edit the textbook myself for my own personal use and just share that with my students. Nobody else has access to this but me and my students, right? Which I think is way cool. Okay, so if you want to do that, you would just hit this download button under the book customization tab. It'll go ahead and it will start downloading that zip file, which will contain all of the chapters of the textbook. So let's go ahead and open that up. And you'll see here there are a bunch of different sections that correspond to all the different sections of the textbook. So if we just click on one of them here, you'll see it'll bring up a Word document-esque file of the textbook, and this is fully customizable, right? So if I didn't want to include this paragraph here in the textbook, I can just get rid of it, right? I could also just get rid of this, right? Or I can add information that is not here, right? So the textbook is fully customizable for your own personal use, and you can share this with your students, right? Nobody else has access to this, right? You did not edit the source material. You're just editing your own personal copy of the textbook, if that makes sense. Okay. All right, so with that said, that pretty much covers a brief rundown of the instructor resources, but what about the student resources? So very similar to a traditional publisher, there's also a student getting started guide. There is a reading and note-taking guide. There is a time management guide. There are student solution guides, as well as guided lecture notes, right? Plenty of various resources here for students to get themselves started with OER and get themselves off on the right foot when it comes to succeeding in your course, right? So in contrast to a lot of common misconception about open education resources, that there aren't a lot of student and instructor resources, there absolutely are, and OER has made tremendous strides in making the quality of this material as close to publisher quality as possible. Okay. So with that said, how many people are using this textbook? Well, we find here that it's used in approximately 2,059 classrooms, and it has saved students approximately $1.85 million in 2023 alone, which again is a staggeringly high number. Okay. So with that said, what was my goal and what was my approach to using this textbook? Well, my highest goal was to evaluate the effectiveness of OpenStax relative to a traditional publisher. And I put relative to a traditional publisher here in parentheses because not all of the survey questions that I asked my students are in relation to a traditional publisher. Some are just solely isolated to OpenStax. But nevertheless, that's the general goal. First of which is I want to evaluate overall grades of OpenStax relative to a traditional publisher. I also wanted to evaluate students' perceptions of their savings using OER, students' perceived effectiveness of OER, students' perceived satisfaction using OER, and finally even some of their perceived difficulties using OER. What was my approach? Well, my general approach was to maintain constancy relative to a traditional publisher. What do I mean by constancy? Well, in other words, I want to keep as much as possible the same relative to a traditional publisher, right? So in other words, that means keeping my lecture slides the same from when I use the publisher, keeping my assignments exactly the same from when I use the publisher, and keeping my test questions exactly the same from when I use the traditional publisher. In other words, I want to make sure that the only major difference between me using the publisher and me using OpenStax is the textbook and textbook alone, to get as close as possible to the relative value of this textbook relative to a traditional publisher. Right? Now, of course, that is not a perfect experiment, right? There's also a lot of other things that differ from when I use the publisher, like a different set of students, to name like one factor, but this is the best I got. Okay. So what did I find? Let's start first with grades. So here they are. So you'll see here that in spring of 2023, I used Norton, right, Psychology in Your Life, and then in fall in 2023, that is when I used OpenStax. And you'll see, simply put, that my grades were pretty comparable. In spring of 2023, when I used Norton, my students were averaging around mid to high C, and then in fall of 2023, when I used OpenStax, my students were also scoring around that mid C range. Right? With one lone exception of this last section here that scored a 74. I do remember that section. They just, for some reason, had a little bit of difficult time. I don't think it had anything to do with the textbook itself. It's just that group of students just was kind of struggling relative to my other sections. I don't know why. Sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to it. You kind of just roll the dice and just one section just isn't really performing quite as well as the others. But even barring that slightly underperforming section, virtually all of my students across both spring and fall are scoring somewhat in the C range. Right? So taken together, I wouldn't expect you to really see any major significant differences in your grades when you use OER. It shouldn't really have that big of a difference at all. Okay. Moving down to the survey questions they asked my students, the first thing you'll notice is that my sample size was kind of small. I did provide the survey link to 3 face-to-face sections, and these are just the students that decide to respond, so a fairly low sample size, but let's review the results nevertheless. So first question here, have you decided to not purchase a textbook because you thought it was too expensive? We see that the vast majority of the students that responded said yes, indicating that it is on their mind, right? They are thinking about textbook costs, and it is potentially leading them to make a decision to not purchase a textbook because they thought it was too expensive, right? Cost is absolutely on their mind. What format did you use most often for reading open education resources for this course? We see that the vast majority of my students read OER online in Canvas or from any links provided, which is exactly how I distribute OER to my students. I either provide them a link to the textbook directly on Canvas, and I also provided a link to the textbook on their syllabus. Next, select the statement that best describes your overall opinion about using OER instead of a traditional commercially published textbook in the course. We see that the most common response is this green bar here, 5. I prefer the OER because of the cost savings and because they are of equivalent in quality to a traditional publisher. Right? Suggesting that students are pretty happy with the OER, and generally speaking, they do find the quality to be quite high. However, with that said, we see that the second most common response is here in black. I prefer OER because of the cost savings, even though I think they are inferior in quality to a traditional publisher. Right? This is indicating that there is still a segment of the student population that at least has the perception that OER is not quite as high quality as what they're getting with a traditional publisher. Regardless of whether that is true or not, right, is certainly to be debated, but I think it is worth noting that there are still perceptions among the student body that OER is not quite as high quality as what you get from, say, Norton. Next, in which of these ways has the OER used in this course made an impact on your experience in the course? We see that the 2 most common responses here are in green as well as in orange, where they have reported that it increased my satisfaction with the learning experience and also improved my ability to complete assignments. Right? You'll see that these 2 responses are very consistent with what other faculty who have done this OER pilot have also reported. Right? Higher satisfaction as well as improved ability to complete their various assignments. Next, which of the following caused difficulty for you when using OER for the course? We find that the vast majority, the most common response here is here in green. I had no difficulties using OER. Right? It is very easy to use. In fact, that's arguably one of the other big selling points of OER is that there aren't a lot of barriers to using it, right? There's no cost barriers, there's no linking anything with a publisher, there's no creating a student set, right? It's literally just posting a link to the textbook on Canvas and boom, you're ready to go. Okay? However, the second most common response here is difficulties reading materials online. Again, arguably another big criticism of OER is that it is a digital-first medium, so if they do want to read the textbook, it is happening almost exclusively on their computer, right? Print copies aren't quite as accessible, and they do have to pay for it. Finally, would you take another course that uses OER or recommend an OER course to a friend? We see that the vast majority of students who took the survey said absolutely yes. So overall, the takeaway messages here from these results is that I didn't really notice any major changes in grades from when I used a traditional publisher, and by and large, student experiences using OER in my class were really quite good and quite positive. And I would suspect and predict that if you elected to use OER in your classrooms, you would have a very similar experience. So with that said, thank you for listening to my OER presentation. Again, I am so sorry I could not make it to our adjunct psychology discipline meeting on All College Day. I do miss you all very dearly, but I hope you found this presentation to be useful. So with that said, if you have any questions about using OER or you plan to incorporate OER for your Psych 103 class, please do not hesitate to reach out to me and I can provide you with any additional support you might need. So that said, take care and have a great rest of your day.